Hi again, friends. It's Jen, and we're back here for the fourth and final video in my video series about my unplugged quilt pattern. So you already know by now, but if you need to get a copy of the pattern, you can do that by going to my website, jengeorgeburt.com. All right, so in the previous video, we talked about constructing the entire quilt top. And now, in this video, we're going to talk about finishing your quilt. So we're going to talk about binding, backing, and quilting. To do that, let's switch over to my desktop view and we'll take it from there. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is binding. So in the original version of the quilt, which is what you see here, I used that same really dark gray, nearly black color that I used in the plugs, and I used that all the way around the outside edge. And in that case, it just sort of framed everything out, and I think that was really successful for that particular version of the quilt. When I made the blue and white version, I sort of thought, well, maybe I'll do white, but you know, I was like, maybe the binding would get dirty if I did white. So what I ended up doing was picking that middle color here, the darkest turquoise, and then I pulled that all the way around the outside edge. So I think that one was successful for that version of the quilt. So a couple other things you might want to consider, a few more things. Maybe you want to do just a contrasting color. For example, in that blue and white one, what if you did, I don't know, hot pink? There's a lot of different ways you could go with that if you just pick a totally different color. Another thing that you might want to consider are stripes. So I almost did that with the blue and white quilt, but I couldn't find exactly the right stripe fabric that I wanted, so I ended up going with a solid. But I love a stripy binding, and I think this quilt in particular could really work with a stripy binding. Other sorts of prints that you might otherwise consider for a binding, that would also work here. And then if you haven't seen them, Art Gallery has recently put out some fabrics that are meant just to be bindings, and they're really cool. So I think they would work really nicely with this quilt. So if you haven't seen those, you might want to go check those out if that sounds like something you might be into. So about the binding. So in the pattern, I have you cut 8 strips from the width of fabric, and that will give you enough fabric to go all the way around the quilt with enough left over that you're not going to be playing binding chicken, so you don't have to worry about that. So the pattern assumes that you're going to cut your strips at 2 1/4 inches wide, and I do that because I have to pick some number, and that's how I cut them, so that's what I went with. If you do that, it will require exactly 1½ yard of fabric, but I rounded that up to 3/4 yard in the pattern because I always round up to the nearest quarter yard, and having exactly the right amount in there is a little bit scary, and I didn't want you to run out of fabric, so that's why it's rounded up. So if you like to cut your strips a little bit wider, like 2½ inches wide, which is also pretty standard, a lot of people do that, you don't need to buy more than 3/4 yard. You'll have plenty of it in there. And then obviously if you're going to cut them skinnier than 2 1/4 inches, if you're like a crazy person who likes really, really skinny bindings, then you obviously won't need more than 1/2 yard probably. So on to backing. So in the pattern, I assume that you're going to be using regular 44 to 45 inch wide regular quilting cotton. And if you're doing that, then the pattern recommends that you buy 4½ yards of that fabric. And then what you would do is you'd take that long, skinny piece of fabric, 4½ yards long, you'd cut it in half to make 2 chunks that are each 2 1/4 inches, 2 1/4 yards long, and then you'd sew them together along their long edges, either before or after you take the selvage off, however you like to make your backing fabric. But that'll give you a rectangle that's big enough to cover the entire back of the quilt. So obviously, if you're doing something different than just, you know, buying 4½ yards, for example, on the back of the original quilt, I just used up all the extra chunks of the fabric from the front, along with some other sort of coordinating solids that I had, and I just made big pieced background and had a party in the back. So obviously, if you're doing it that way, you'd have to figure out how big it all needs to be, but I'm sure you can handle that. On the blue and white version, I actually bought that 108-inch wide backing fabric, and it's this super fun Sally Kelly fabric that I had found a while back that I used on there. And so the really great thing about that is I just bought the yardage. I didn't have to think about it other than is it long enough? It's definitely wide enough. And then I just drop that off with my quilt at the long armor, and I didn't have to piece the backing at all. So that's a really handy way to go about it. So on to quilting. In the original version of the quilt, I hand quilted it. So you can see it here. So all in the background is sort of an all over sort of continuous line quilting pattern in the background. And then the plugs are quilted separately. So they have dimension and stuff added to those. So I'll show you some close-up pictures so you can see. So this is when I was doing a sort of a tester on, this is a very small piece, like a foot by a foot or something. So this is when I was making sure that my stencil and the chalk was going to show up on all the different fabrics. And it did. So these are the Hancy continuous line stencils, and then their ultimate pounce powder is what I used to go through there. So that powder, that chalk just irons away when you're done with it. So it's really cool product. I really like it. Once I had chalked it, which I chalked in small sections, I just went over the lines and just quilted them with big stitch hand quilting. And you can see here in the blue section, I used blue thread. And then as it crossed over into the yellow, I switched to yellow thread. And I did that in all the sections. So the pink has pink, and the orangish color has orangish color, and so on. So it's the same pattern and it's continuous, but I just broke the thread, just started a new thread at the seam there. And you can see here on the plugs, see how I put more straight lines on the plug parts just to give them some more dimension and stuff. So I thought that turned out pretty good. I liked it. On the blue and white quilt, Martina, who long armed this for me, she did a free motion all over sort of, square swirl. That's really hard to say. And she did it all freehand, and she wanted me to tell you this is definitely something you could pull off with a domestic machine. So if you're doing free motion on your domestic, you just start at the top and you go down in a line from top to bottom, and you do a swirl, and then you go down and then you do a swirl, and you continue on like that, and then you start again at the top. So this is definitely something you could pull off if you're into free motion on your own domestic machine. So a few other ideas. I almost did matchstick quilting on the blue and white version. I think that would look really cool, really close lines all running in the same direction. A simple grid would work really well too. So you could just do some nice straight lines in one direction and then turn the quilt the other way and do straight lines in the other direction. And you could make them an even grid or an uneven grid, whatever you like. So I think another thing that would work really well with this pattern are those geometric patterns that you do using your walking foot. So I'm talking about the sort of thing like Jackie Garrett talks about in her book, Walk and Walk 2.0. So if you've seen those, or if you don't know what those are, look those up, because I really think those would work nicely here. Another thing I thought about is, what if you did a different quilting pattern for each column? That might look kind of cool. And then what if you were, even if you're not doing it, if you're not hand quilting it like I did, what if you still changed the thread color for each column and did it in a different color? That might be cool. And then obviously you can just do anything your heart desires. There's a lot of background space, a lot of negative space on this, so there's a lot of opportunity to play around. So you can really just do so much stuff here. I'm really excited to see what other people do with this actually. Okay, so here we are. We've reached the end of the video series about my unplugged quilt pattern. And I really hope that you've enjoyed the video series and that you found it fun and informative. I've enjoyed making them, and I definitely think I'm going to be making more of these video series, maybe about some upcoming quilt patterns, or maybe just some shorter form videos. But if you haven't already done so, you're going to want to subscribe to my YouTube channel and maybe turn on the notifications so you'll know when more of those come out. So I want to wrap up by saying thank you to all of you who have bought my patterns, who have made versions of my patterns. It is truly a thrill to get to see all the things that you all create from my patterns. So truly, thank you, and I hope to see you around soon. Keep quilting, friends.